Welcome everyone. Tonight's presentation from Bartlett Tree Experts. Before we get started, a couple housekeeping items. First of all, MAREA is the Mid-Atlantic Renewable Energy Association. We are an all-volunteer nonprofit dedicated to education on renewable energy and sustainable living. We have upcoming monthly presentations and coming up on March 29th. We'll learn about growing food and generating power on the same land. And then in April, we will hear from some folks doing vertical farming on a relatively small scale, and we think we'll learn a lot from that. And that's on April 26th. And beyond that, May, June, July, the topics will be related to advances in solar technologies, microgrids, and possibly composting. So stay tuned to the marea.org or your emails. Phil, you want to take it away?
Sure. Tonight's presentation is using biochar in landscape and shade tree management. Biochar has been part of an indigenous practices for millennia, and now we are learning in detail how important it is to the health of trees. Tonight's presenter, Kelby Fite, is an expert in biochar and its effect on trees. He will share what he has learned in a botanical and gastronomical adventure into the life of trees. Kelby has been a member of the Bartlett Tree Research Laboratories team for 20 years. In his current position as Vice President and Director of Research, his key area of responsibility is research and public education in shade tree management and arboriculture, with emphasis on urban soils and integrated pest management. That arboriculture is really a new word for me. Got to work on that one. He holds a PhD in plant and environmental science from Clemson University with a research focus on urban soil renovation and root biology. He also holds a Master of Science in plant protection and pest management and a Bachelor of Science in horticulture, both from the University of Georgia. Welcome, Kelby. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. And yeah, arboriculture is acceptable. Arboriculture is also acceptable, depending on which side of the Mason-Dixon that you're on. So,
okay, thank you.
yeah, either is acceptable. So yeah, thanks for inviting me over and allowing me to do this. And I would say I'm not an expert in global carbon or biochar, but certainly have a lot of experience over the past decade working with biochar and its impacts on trees and tree health. So what I'm going to do is start out briefly, just kind of an overview. Chuck had asked me to sort of give an overview of tree care and soil care. So I'm going to start with that, and then I'll shift over into more of the direct impacts of biochar. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at a few of the impacts and ways that we care for trees, and more specifically tree roots below ground. So one of the things we don't think about with trees and what goes on below ground, and that's where I spend a majority of my research time, is what's going on below the soil surface. And we have to understand that tree roots have multiple functions for the trees. One of which is we hope that they're there for anchorage and keep the trees upright and resilient to wind loads and the like, and they're there for anchorage. And that's one type of root function. Another one that we're going to primarily focus on happens with these fine roots, fine feeder roots. So these are roots 1-2 millimeters in diameter and smaller. So think of them like angel hair, spaghetti, and smaller size roots. And this is where the primary water and nutrient uptake occurs, and where the biological activity, the interface of soil and root, takes place. So regardless of the size of tree, regardless how massive this organism is, these fine feeder roots, these tiny roots, is where the water and nutrient uptake occurs. And I'll show you a graphic of that here in a minute. Also, they're huge storage organs. Sugars, photosynthates that are produced throughout the growing season are sent to that root system, converted to starches for storage over the winter. And here over the next few weeks, couple of months, those sugars are reallocated above ground for growth for this current season's foliage that we're all going to enjoy. And then finally, a lot of growth hormones are produced in the root system, and these tree roots respond to the soil environment and produce either growth enhancing or growth inhibiting hormones below ground. So a lot of functions that the root systems serve for the trees, and we quite honestly take it for granted what goes on down. So when we talk about the fine feeder roots, these tiny, again, angel hair, spaghetti, and smaller roots, this is where the majority of the water and nutrient uptake occurs for that tree. And here's some graphics out of Zeiger's Plant Physiology text, if you're familiar with it, where we look at a fine feeder root and we correlate that to this graphic. So on the y-axis, in this case, this happens to be rate of water uptake. This could be a given nutrient uptake rate, but in this case, this is water. And then on the x-axis, we have the distance back from the meristematic tissue or this growing point, the root tip. Okay, so this is where cells are actively dividing and elongating. And if you notice, the further back we move away from this meristematic tissue, so along the x-axis, look at what happens to the water uptake rates. So right here in this area of elongation, root hair formation, that's where the majority of the water and nutrient uptake occurs. And then as that root begins to suberize or pigment and turn from white to brown, the water uptake rates literally just fall off a cliff. So even within the large biomass that exists below ground in our urban shade trees, we take a subset of that tissue, of that biomass, and that fine feeder root system. That's where the water and nutrient uptake occurs. And then even within that fine root biomass, the smallest subset, that growing point tissue, that white fleshy root tissue where we're actively growing, actively cell dividing, that's where the majority of water and nutrient uptake occurs. Once you see that root begin to pigment and brown, the water and nutrient uptake falls off a cliff. So think about that like a subset of the below ground biomass is responsible for water and nutrient uptake in our large urban shade tree canopies. So I just want to instill that appreciation in you of what actually goes on down there, the amount of energy that can be expended, the photosynthate that can be expended actively taking up some nutrients below ground. Take it for granted, but there's a lot going on there. So where do roots of shade trees grow? You may have seen an image that looks different than this with what root systems look like. Oftentimes you'll see an image where the above ground portion of the tree, there's a mirror image of it below ground. When you see that, discard that. This is what the architecture of trees that we're going to come in contact with looks like. In the eastern part of the United States, certainly in developed situations, it almost looks like a pancake. But we have to talk about what type of roots. So roots that are there for anchorage, so things like oblique roots, heart roots, tap roots, sinker roots, those are there for anchorage, keeping the tree upright. And those are certainly going to grow deeper, depending on soil conditions, 1, 2, maybe even 3 feet deep. The fine feeder roots, and the ones that are taking up water and nutrient uptake, the vast majority of those are limited to the upper 6 to 8 inches in soil depth. So again, there may be a lot of biomass there, but it's confined to that upper surface, maybe 10 inches of depth at the soil surface. They can expand horizontally quite extensively. So we're talking drip line. We use the term drip line in arboriculture. And that would be as if we held this tree in this image, if we held it right here on the trunk as an umbrella, where the water would drip off of the canopy, the drip line of the tree. And they can extend 2 or 3 times, maybe even more than that, horizontally out beyond that canopy. So very shallow, but very wide and extensive root systems. We have to ask yourself, why do they grow there? Why, if you were a tree, wouldn't you send roots deeper as opposed to horizontally? And that's where the getting's good, right? That's where the water is, that's where the oxygen is, the nutrients exist, and then hopefully if we manage it right, where the organic component, that forest duff layer would exist. So I like to think of roots as opportunistic, right? They go where the getting's good. They're no dummies. And to prove that to you, if you've ever walked down the street and had a portion of the sidewalk lifting, why is that occurring? Because roots are growing right at the interface of the soil surface and the underside of the concrete slab, where condensation forms, where there's less resistance to that root penetration. Again, they take the path of least resistance. And if you've ever had a sewer pipe clogged up with tree roots, there's a reason they're there, right? They follow water, they follow nutrients, they go where the getting's good, they're opportunistic in growth habit. And we can use that to our advantage in how we manage trees, but more on that in a minute. So when we talk about soil conditions, a professor at Harvard back in the 80s, Philip Craul, defined what urban soils are. And these don't necessarily have to be urban center soils. Think of these as developed soils, even suburban soils. Most of you step outside of your house, that is a developed soil because it's impacted by human activities. So he defined it for us. It's going to have great variability. Modified soil structure typically is going to be compacted. Surface crust will form, which is hydrophobic, and we know that if we go pour a bucket of water out on the soil surface, and most of our soils in our landscape, the majority of it runs right off. Soil pH is usually going to be elevated. It's going to be more alkaline. Aeration is restricted because of that compaction. The porosity of the soil is reduced. Nutrient cycling is interrupted, right? We cart off our leaf litter, maybe not those of us on this group, but the vast majority of citizens cart the leaf litter off to the curb. So we interrupt that nutrient cycling that would happen in nature. There's all sorts of contaminants and man-made materials. If you've ever gone to plant a shrub in your yard and hit a 2x4 or a brick or a dead body, there's all kinds of things down there contaminating our soil. And then temperature regimes, because of the exposure, we get modified temperature regime. So if I were a tree, this would be the last soil I would pick that I would choose to grow in. But this, unfortunately, is the soil condition that we plant most of our suburban, urban shade trees in. So keep this in mind, that the soils are less than optimum, but this is the reality of what we have to deal with when managing shade trees in the landscape. So quick story, hate to pick on Ivy League universities, but I'm taking this picture out of a stairwell at a university, and I'm looking out at a construction site, obviously. And I hope that it's pretty apparent to most of you that there is very little on this construction site going into the protection of this established tree canopy. And what's tragic to me about this is that the building you see constructed in the background of the photo is a LEED platinum building. So this is the greenest of the green buildings, composting toilets, harvesting rainwater runoff, right? Super efficient water usage. But if you look at what we're doing to the landscape outside, that doesn't add up. And to make the story even worse, I'm standing in the stairwell of the existing forestry building at Yale and looking at the construction of the new forestry building at Yale. So not to pick on them, but I'm going to pick on them. But we all do it. We all see it every day. And unfortunately, we don't do enough to preserve the soils on the front end of a construction or development project. So we find ourselves trying to reconstruct them and rehabilitate them back end of a project, which is where biochar comes in. And we'll get into that in a moment. And if you don't believe me, again, you heard I went to the University of Georgia. So one of our best known professors in the world of arboriculture is Dr. Kim Coder. And one of his quotes is that every place where humans exist and the machines that support us exist, soil compaction will be present. And prove that to you, there's now moon dust compaction. So basically, wherever we go, there will be some level of soil compaction. And quite honestly, we do a lot of that just with foot traffic. When we see college campuses or corporate campuses, just foot traffic and where people walk can impose some of the most severe soil compaction we encounter. So if we have the ideal soil, this is just sort of a simple pie graph of what the ideal planting soil would look like, where we have on the left about half of that soil volume being pore space, and it'd be nice to have that divided equally into large macropores for water and air infiltration, but quick drainage, and then the other portion of that being micropores, small pore spaces for water holding capacity. And then the other half of that being the sand, silt, clay, and then organic matter component, which we would love to see around 5% by volume organic matter. So this is the ideal soil, but this is typically what we have in the urban landscape, where we take, I consider it like a sponge. If you take a sponge and you squeeze it in your hand, you're not squeezing out sponge, you're squeezing out pore space. And that's exactly what we do when we compact soils, is we remove that pore space. And not only that, but we remove disproportionately more macropores than we do micropores, which again creates that hydrophobic situation where water doesn't infiltrate rapidly and can restrict aeration in those soils. And this does a lot of bad things for trees, and ultimately it results in reduced photosynthetic rate. So why do we see often trees decline after construction? Sometimes there's root damage, of course, but other times it's just these downstream effects from soil compaction. Then we have to remediate them. So I know many of you may have had dinner at this point. So if you're squeamish, you may want to look away. I'm going to play you a video real quick of a root growing. So this is below ground root growth in a loose soil. And you can see what happens when it intersects with a more fine textured clay soil. So that resistance to root growth, cells are still dividing. They just can't elongate as well. The root begins to swell in diameter, but it can't penetrate that fine texture compacted soil. If we till or loosen that soil, we reduce the resistance, and the root's able to penetrate and grow into that tilled, cultivated soil. But then some cases, and you've probably seen the crews out on the side of the road with a soil auger augering out the holes, and those can actually just result in root deflection and no penetration out into the landscape soil under severe compaction conditions. So if you were squeamish, you can look again. The graphic imagery is over. Oh, all right. So we know about compaction. One of the things we do in arboriculture is fertilize, and I know there's probably some people that are proponents and some that are opponents to fertilization. And what we try to do is handle responsible fertilization where necessary. But this is just some of the background of the research from a few decades ago that sort of led us into the industry standards that we operate under. So we're governed by the American National Standards Institute, the A300 ANSI standard, and that tells us when and how to respond to nutrient needs to plants. So this is some of the background research. This is from Ed Gilman, who's professor emeritus at the University of Florida, and this shows that under certain conditions, that trees can and will benefit from, in this case, this is nitrogen. And this was some of his work that showed that 5 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, anything above that in this research study, there was no benefit. So we would be moving into irresponsible use of nutrients at that point. But again, this was just some of the original information that we were working with. So what gets tough working with large organisms and then working with below ground tissues that we can't visually inspect and it's hard to quantify is you balance this with research like this. And this is a root density scan from Dr. Gary Watson at the Morton Arboretum outside of Chicago. And what Dr. Watson did was look at root density in response to, in this case, nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers. So this was a root scan from nitrogen treatments. And in the panel on the left, you can clearly see that we had greater root density, in this case, in the proximity of nitrogen fertilizer, as opposed to the right-hand panel that was in the control treatment, so no fertilizer. And again, I think pictures are sometimes a little more impactful than charts and graphs. But we have to think about the methodology here that Dr. Watson used to achieve this. And I just want to show you my fantastic PowerPoint skills here. So what Dr. Watson did was he actually harvested a core of soil, and you can see all the fine root growth around, and then backfilled that core with a fertilizer amendment, and then measured 4 and 7 inches away from that site of application to harvest these types of data. So this is a microsite effect. So we placed a deposit of fertility, and then he measured at 4 and 7 inches away from that area of deposit, how roots responded. Okay, and if you think back to the first couple of slides, I showed you, and I hope I proved to you through sidewalks and sewer lines, that roots are opportunistic and they flourish in areas that are advantageous for them to be. So this is quite different, perhaps, than how we manage nutrients current day. And again, to further complicate it, reaching into some text, and if any of you suffer from insomnia on here, you can pick yourself up the Mineral Nutrition of Higher Plants, Horst Marshner. This will fix you right up. But you look at some more agricultural literature, and here's a graphic from this text that shows that with increasing nitrogen supply, and in this case, it's just a line drawing of corn, there's a shift away from root growth and into shoot growth. Okay. But in the last panel, I just showed you that nitrogen encourages root growth. Well, this is more of an agricultural system where we'd be fertilizing bulk soil as opposed to micronutrient pockets, right? These little microsites. And then again, in the horticultural world, these are some data from NC State, again, way back in the early 80s, that showed that with increasing nitrogen treatments, there was a shift more towards shoot growth over root growth. And these were containerized shrubs. So again, fertilization of the entire root system as opposed to microsites of fertility. So it's likely that the plants are going to respond differently in how they allocate photosynthase and where they spend their budget based on different fertilization regimes. So how else do we mess up soils? And hopefully no one on this meeting does this, but we probably see our friends and neighbors doing this every fall of who could look at those unsightly leaves. Let's cart them off to the curb, make them disappear, and then we'll buy them back as compost later on. And the cycle continues. But this is what we do, right? Is we break that carbon cycle that's occurring out in the forests all around us, and we interrupt that return of nutrient, of organic component back into the soil. And most of our estimates based on data we've produced, it's 1 to 2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet that we remove from the nutrient cycle just by simply removing this foliage. It depends on species and location, but we're removing a significant amount of fertility by removing this leaf litter every fall. And then we turn around and pay to fertilize. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's what we do. So again, preaching to the choir here, but we lose all the benefits of this recycling of the organic matter back into the forest soil, the carbon source, feeding the microorganisms, promoting this microbial degradation of organic components in the soil, building soil structure, water holding capacity. Again, you guys know all of this. So we're losing all these benefits by carting our leaves off in the fall. Well, probably one of the most common practices in landscape management to sort of offset that loss of organic matter is the use of surface mulching. Again, this is a classic image here from Dr. Watson at the Morton Arboretum. And in this case, these were white oak trees and root density under grass, surface of grass, and the root density of the white oak underneath grass versus under a mulch layer. And again, you can obviously see the increase in root density because of the lack of competition with the grass, the lack of mowing operations, soil compaction. So we all know the long list of benefits, I hope, of adding a mulch layer instead of having turf up to the base of the tree. Lots of benefits there. I'm not going to read these to you. Probably the most impactful to me is the prevention of mower blight, which is the dreaded disease that is spread by Johnny Weed Whack here when he comes along to string trim around a birch and girdle that tree with a string trimmer. And trust me, I know how old this photo is, but I mean, I hate to get rid of this guy. They don't make them like that anymore. So that is one of the big benefits, keeping mower and maintenance operations away from the base of the tree. And if a little mulch is good, then a lot of mulch must be even better. And that is sarcasm. I hope no one does this. We refer to this in arboriculture as volcano mulching. all sorts of bad things happen. We're putting tissue and the trunk tissue underground, right under a mulch layer, and that tissue was never designed to be in moist conditions. So it can lead to the intrusion of certain diseases into that tissue, and it can also promote what we call adventitious roots, rooting from that trunk tissue that can lead to some long-term problems in the management of that tree. So yeah, do not volcano mulch. We want wide mulch rings, not deep mulch rings. 3 to 4 inches of mulch max, but we want it nice and wide. Preferably, we'd love to see it out to the drip line of that tree, and the edge of the canopy is where we would love to see it. All right, so that's kind of the problems. I'm going to shift gears now into what do we do about it, and then that will involve biochar. So we have an established tree. We have these soil issues we have to deal with, the compaction, the nutrient status, the low organic matter status. How do we correct that? And here again in a few weeks, we're going to be preparing our gardens, and we might break out our Troy build or Cub Cadet tiller and prepare that ground. Not a good idea with established trees because we're going to damage the root system, and we're probably going to damage your arms and your tiller in the process. So there have been many strategies over the years in how we can accomplish this decompaction and amendment. And you see a list of them here, and I'll sort of run through some examples for you. This is what we refer to in the industry as vertical mulching. So we would use either an electric drill or a gas-powered soil auger and make holes in the soil, okay, in a grid sort of pattern. And then with that hole, we would amend that with some sort of improved soil mixture. So it could be just the soil that came right out of the hole. It could be one amended with a fertilizer. And in the image you see on the right-hand side, this was amended with biochar right into those holes. So this is vertical mulching. Radial trenching, very similar, but instead of what I call the Swiss cheese method with vertical mulching, we're actually making trenches, and in this case, a traditional trencher. And these are in a radial fashion from near the trunk to out to or beyond the drip line. Again, both of these were kind of creating those microsite, either vertical pockets or those trenches to improve the soil conditions for the tree roots to exploit. Again, this is some work from Gary Watson at the Morton Arboretum, and what he found was, this is root density on the y-axis. What he found was by doing this radial trenching and replacing the soil in that trench with either an improved soil with 50-50 compost mixed into it or 100% compost, is that the only significant effect on increasing root density was if we took that trench and replaced it with 100% compost. That's where the root density was increased significantly. Adjacent to, just outside of that trench and beyond the trench, there was no significant effect on root density. Again, microsite effect. Only in that trench with 100% compost did he see an increase in root density. There's been some other gizmos developed, pneumatic decompaction devices. So in this case, it could use nitrogen or compressed air to actually penetrate the soil and then cause almost like a fracking, like a small discharge of fracturing of that soil. The studies involving these have shown that the effects are only temporary at best and have no long-term significant improvement in soil quality or plant growth. And then tools like, I'll refer to it as the Airspade. That's a brand. It could be the Air Knife. There's also a soil pick. I'm just going to use the term Airspade because that's the tool that I have the most experience with. So the Airspade came along, and what the Airspade does is channel compressed air through this tip in such a way that it will excavate porous materials like soil while minimizing or eliminating damage to non-porous materials. So the gas line industry developed these tools so that they could excavate utility trenches until they get in the proximity of gas and other utility lines, and then finish the excavation with tools like the Airspade, so they wouldn't sever those gas lines and other utility lines, but still be able to excavate trenches. So we've been using it in arboriculture for 20 or 25 years, and we used to use it in those over mulching scenarios to move away the mulch, excavate what we refer to as the root flare or the buttress roots of those trees so that we can go in there and evaluate the trees better and maybe do some root surgery. Well, we can use it in a different manner as well. We can use it in soils to not only excavate and uncover fine root systems like you see here, we can actually use it to cultivate and amend those soils as well. So this is what that looks like in use. So you can see it connected here to a minimum of 185 CFM air compressor and channels the air through this hose into the Airspade. You can see that the Airspade is oriented directly down into the ground. Again, we're just doing the same thing that we would be doing with a traditional tine tiller. We're just using air to fracture and cultivate the soil as opposed to mechanical tines of a tiller. So if we look at the major tree stresses below ground, we've talked about soil compaction, right? We can till it. We have nutrient poor soils. We could fertilize based on a soil analysis, balance the soil pH based on the need of the plant species. We can incorporate organic matter in multiple forms, and then we can apply a proper mulch layer. Again, not deep, but wide mulch layer. And in Bartlett, we refer to this as root invigoration. It's a patented term, but everybody uses it. It's just this soil amendment and cultivation practice. Again, it's using the Airspade. Again, you can see it in action here. Oriented vertically, we're not trying to move soil off site. We want to keep that soil on site, but we want to fracture it and cultivate it. All right. So step one is that loosening. And because the target here are the roots that take up water, take up nutrients, those are fine roots. If you think back to the depth that those exist in most of our landscape situation, they're in the upper 6 to 8 inches in depth. So that's our focus on loosening the soil in that upper 8 inches of soil surface. So we loosen that thoroughly, and then we amend it again with prescription fertilizers based on the soil test. pH amendment. So if our pH is too high, we're typically going to amend with sulfur. If it's too low, we're going to use lime. And then this is where biochar comes in as a component of this organic amendment. We always blend this with compost and fertilizers, and I'll show you some data to support that here in a moment. So then we take the amendments. If you've never seen the inside of a biochar particle, this is why we do it, right? This is the electron micrograph of the inside of a biochar particle. We'll come back to this in a moment. But this is the ability of that biochar particle to adhere water, nutrients, and set up homes for microbial communities. Okay, so we've added this biochar surface area in with compost, with nutrients. We come back in with the Airspade and we homogenize that mixture, blend these amendments into the native soil, and then the final step is mulch and thorough irrigation. All right, so that's the rehabilitation process that we go through for established urban shade trees. And again, if you think about if you were going to plant a tree, these are standard things you do to prepare the soil to plant a tree. You would till it, you would amend it, you would fertilize it, you would water it. It's just a way of doing that with established shade trees. So with that, I'm going to switch over quick to separate presentation. And we can see that. Chuck, can you see that? Give me a thumbs up. We're good? Okay. Excellent. All right. So we're going to focus a little more specifically on biochar and just quickly run through some of the studies. And sort of, this is a very practical applied presentation because that's the type of science we do. There are plenty of people doing the academic research on biochar. We're more focused on the applications of it. So when it first came along, it was probably 2008, 2009 when we first started hearing about biochar. We were like, is this coming in the long line of horticultural snake oils? In our trade magazines, there's all sorts of elixirs that will cure every plant problem out there. There's even sick tree treatment in a bag. We were kind of thinking this was probably going to fall in the lines of that. And our director at the time looked at it, saw it was really messy and dusty, and he was like, "Hey, Kelby, why don't you check this out?" So I got to be the one to do the research on a potentially messy product. So before we jump into the biochar is not a silver bullet, right? This is not a panacea. It's not going to fix every tree problem, as some biochar vendors are claiming. It's not going to come to your house and do your dishes, wash your laundry, none of that. And as with everything in arboriculture, there's going to be variability, right? Depending on tree species, soil conditions, site conditions, the type of biochar, where this is, variability. So you have to lay down these guidelines. And for us, arboriculture is a tough industry because trees are large, slow-growing organisms. So it's hard to turn around meaningful research and data on long-term effects when that takes a lot of time. So a lot of the studies I'm going to talk about haven't biologically lasted that long. But if we look at a graduate student track, most we can get is 2 to 3 years worth of research. So that's a caveat on everything. We don't know what's going to happen long term because we've only really been working with it in arboriculture for about 10 years, which to me means job security. And it's not a standalone treatment, right? I mentioned we blend it with compost, we blend it with nutrient products, and you'll see why here in a moment. So where did the interest come from with biochar? There's a term in Portuguese, Terra preta, which is black earth or dark earth. And our archaeologists digging in these regions kept stumbling across the soils like you see in this image here, where the upper meter or so of the soil was extremely black, rich, highly fertile, highly productive soils in tropical soils that are otherwise extremely weathered, low productivity, low organic matter, warm year-round, constant microbial activity. But we know no one's been amending these soils with compost because these civilizations collapsed centuries ago. So no one's been out there composting these soils in at least a few hundred years. So whatever they did had some sort of permanency in improving these soils. And it turns out they amended with what we now call biochar. They likely called it something quite different. So this is what it might look like. So agricultural soils, they would go down to the Amazon River basin as a way of fertilizing and amending these soils, bring back wet, lush, succulent plant material, and lay it on these cool burns that they would have going in their agricultural fields. And if you know how charcoal is produced through pyrolysis, biomass is heated, but oxygen is excluded, which is what the big wet leaf would do. And they would lay it on these cool burns, so you get thermal degradation of this biomass, producing a char particle instead of ash. I don't think OSHA would approve of these working conditions, but you get the idea. We're a little more sophisticated than that now, and in some places, not a whole lot more. But this is one of the cool things about biochar. So this is a graphic from Johannes Lehmann, kind of one of the gurus of all things biochar. He's at Cornell. And so this is the percent carbon remaining in a biomass particle. And for me, that means a wood chip. That's, as an arborist, that's where my mind goes. And then on the x-axis is years, right, over time. So through pyrolysis, and again, I'm not the guy to explain the thermodynamics of pyrolysis by any means, but through pyrolysis, we drive off of about half the carbon in a particle through syngas, and again, I'm getting way out of my league. But what we're left with in that char particle, the roughly 50% of the carbon that's left in that char particle has a permanency in soil. So in this case, Johannes only goes out 5 years, but we could continue drawing this line on to the right based on things we know from those Amazon cultures, right? That these char particles have resonancy in those soils. They're recalcitrant in the soils. They don't degrade. They have that permanency over time. Whereas we take that same particle, that wood chip, and instead of turning it into a char particle, we start out day one with 100% of the carbon in it, but through microbial degradation as a mulch layer or an amendment, the microorganisms in the soil are going to consume and degrade that carbon and return it back to the atmosphere. So that was one of the first things that attracted us to biochar. And I know many of you on the call, that is probably the most attractive thing about biochar. And the tree health benefits are probably secondary at best. If you don't believe me, believe the press, right? Because they're always right. So USA Today had it several years ago. Could chicken manure help curb climate change? And it focused on a chicken farmer in West Virginia who offset, I can't remember the number, it was something like $60,000 a year in propane usage to heat his growing houses with the heat generated from pyrolysis. And then he had this, for him, secondary product of biochar that he was then selling to the local farmers to them in their fields. It's a great story until you read that, you know, he was propped up by a federal grant that we all paid for because it wasn't cost effective at the time. But again, this was 10, 12, maybe 15 years ago. CNN had it as one of the 8 weird ways to save the earth. There's a biochar textbook. There's YouTube channels. It's made the big time now. There's a real focus with biochar production on using waste streams. Let's not start cutting down trees to produce biochar. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So let's focus on waste streams. And a term I'd never heard before until I started working with biochar is corn stover or stalks of corn. So if you think about the millions, probably billions of acres of corn stover in the Midwest, could we take the carbon that's in that corn stover and lock it away on that permanent time scale and turn it back into the soil as opposed to letting it degrade and that carbon return to the atmosphere? For us, again, as our industry, we're focused on wood chips. That's our waste product. Certainly it has uses for us as mulch, can be turned into compost, and that's great, but can we take that wood particle and turn that into a char particle and lock that carbon away on a totally different time scale? Again, focus on like peanut shells, rice hulls, these waste streams that we struggle to do something productive with. Can we turn those into meaningful char particles? And one of the things we know is that not all biochars are created equal, and that may not be a bad thing. It's a very contextual assessment, because what might make a good biochar in my soils or my plant species might be a bad one for you, or vice versa. Okay, so it's not this is not a binary decision, right? This is objective. So if we take this is kind of a Rube Goldberg or a pretty low tech production facility. So we take this wood chip biochar and we run it through I'll call it a doohickey, a pyrolysis doohickey here, and we produce a raw, fresh biochar. So is this biochar good? Is it bad? How do we know? And we just don't, because it depends on what are we making the biochar out of. And wood chips, are there differences in hardwood species and softwood species? What if we have a mix of them? What about if we can use an invasive species like bamboo, right? Is that going to make a good biochar? And the answer is subjective. And then what type of doohickey did we make it out of? Was it something like this, or was it very sophisticated? How much oxygen made its way into the process? What temperature was it formed in? All these play in there. And then with the end product, what is it? How much absorption capacity does it have? Is there ash content, which could elevate the pH, which again, if I have an acidic soil, great, that's good. If I have an alkaline soil, that's bad. So it's very subjective as to what does and does not make a good biochar. But again, it's a buyer beware market. They're not all created equal. So again, I'm going to run through just some overview of the research that we have in the next 10 minutes or so, and I'll wrap up then at that point. And what we've got right now is, this isn't published yet, but this will be hopefully on the next couple of issues of Arboriculture and Urban Forestry, which is the International Society of Arboriculture's scientific journal. One of my coworkers, Emma Shaffert, she's completing her PhD at the University of Reading in the UK, and she is publishing this review of everything we know about biochar in the arboriculture industry, which is not a whole lot. 46 papers, and most of those have been produced since 2012. So again, we're making long-term decisions for short-term data, but we have to start somewhere. This is something that she had gathered, and this is, I know it's a busy graphic. Don't worry about trying to read it. But what we wanted to show you just to reinforce the variability of biochar is the lower dark green portion of the graph. That's the resident carbon that are in these different types of char particles. So this is that long-term carbon that's going to remain in the soil. It could become a carbon sink, is the beauty of the biochar particle. These three graphs on the left, these are uncharred particles. So if you notice, all the char particles have increases in resident carbon, but are they all the same? No. Okay. So there's great variability, and that's one thing that we know that Emma's publishing on, is that it's extremely variable. It's a buyer beware market when it comes to biochar. Again, is one better or worse? The answer is it depends. So there's the International Biochar Initiative, and so you may want to hit their website up. They are sort of the clearinghouse for all things biochar, and they're working towards industry standards. So at least we're all speaking the same language. So it's not quite as a buyer beware market, so that we can have consistent language. So we're all using the same term and characteristics that we're measuring and talking about. Some of the basic requirements for feedstock, and then what are the tests that we can all agree on are valid for biochar? And you can see them. I'm not going to read those to you. But what we'd love to get to in biochar land is sort of where we are with bags of fertilizer. So when you go to purchase fertilizer, you get a guaranteed analysis and you get a derived from list. So you know what the analysis of that fertilizer is and where it came from, right? Which can have some profound impacts on how we use it. No such thing exists in biochar now. It's a bit of buyer beware market now, but at least the IBI is working towards these standard terms, standard testing requirements, so that we can make an apples to apples comparison. And again, I'll skip this one. This is some of Emma's PhD work, just highlighting the variability that exists out there. And this is just across 4 different types of biochar and the ranges of variability. I won't bore you with that. Just trust me, it's extremely variable. So with different soils, we can have different effects. With water holding capacity, again, that porosity, think back to that electron micrograph, and you can see here in this image, extremely porous materials. I had it referred to this way. So a gram of high quality biochar, which is barely even a handful, like probably a tablespoon or so of high quality biochar, has a surface area of a tennis court. It was like 200 square meters. So if you take a tennis court, 2-dimensional tennis court, and you crumple it all up into a 3-dimensional wad of tennis court into the palm of your hand, that's how much surface area or potential exchange sites there are in that gram of biochar, which my mind struggles to wrap around that concept. But with all that porosity comes the capacity to hang on to stuff. And one of those stuffs is water, the ability to hang on to and exchange water with the soil solution, i.e. the fine feeder roots that we talked about with trees. And certainly in soils, sandier soils that have less water holding capacity, the increases in water holding capacity are going to be more profound with biochar. But even in fine texture soils like clays, all this porosity can be beneficial as well to allow for more rapid drainage and aeration of those soils. So in both of the soil types, coarse or finer soils, biochar can have some benefits there. And then cation exchange capacity, or the ability of that soil or char particle to hang on to positively charged ions like calcium, magnesium. Again, sandy soils typically have lower CECs to begin with, so the benefit of biochar particle is going to be more impactful there. And again, disclaimer here is we're by no means making any broad-reaching biochar recommendations. That we have taken to account not only soil type and biochar quality, but plant species, ultimate goal, a site assessment as well. I'll skip this. Well, maybe I won't. Okay, so I'll run through it real quick. So on the x-axis, we have pyrolysis temperature in Celsius from 200 up to 900. And then on the y-axis, this is just percentage of yield. So we begin with 100% of the biomass we start with. So as we heat that material up, heat that biomass up, we start breaking chemical bonds and driving off all of the compounds in that particle. Again, my head goes to wood chips. But if we're going to produce cooking charcoal, and you're going to grill your steak or your portobello mushroom, you want to strike the match and hold it to that charcoal particle and have it light, right? And those volatile compounds burn, heat your grill, and enjoy your meal. We don't want that in biochar. We want to continue to heat that particle up and break more of those chemical bonds, those tars, the resins, the sugars that are in that organic component, and open up more of that porosity. So we continue to heat up that particle. And here in sort of that 500 to 600 degrees Celsius range, that's where most good biochars are produced, this range. And that's sort of the sweet spot of opening up that porosity and all that exchange site for this biochar particle to hang on to stuff. Again, water, nutrients, microbial communities in the soil. And again, this is the inside of the biochar particle. You can think about like how much surface area there is there for water and nutrients and microbial communities to build their home and improve the soil conditions. So here's a few of the studies I'll run through in the next couple of minutes where we simulated planting pits. And this is at our Arboretum in Charlotte, where we tried to sort of simulate what it's like to be a tree in the city. And we amended soils with different rates of biochar, different rates of fertilizers. And we did the same in the UK at our UK lab with different species, different types of biochars. And what we found was in both studies in 2 to 3 years, very little plant performance difference. Again, we're dealing with large, long-term organisms and short-term results. We did see some shifts in nutrient availability, but no significant results in plant growth or performance or any metric that our clients would perceive. In Vancouver, British Columbia, we had existing street trees, boulevard trees as they call them. And at this point we were thinking about how can we get biochar in the soil some other way than having to do all this destructive work with the Airspade. So we have biochar powder. So this is a 70 mesh and finer biochar powder. I like to call it black lung in a bag. And we suspend that in a water solution with nutrients and do soil injections. And that was a method we tried here in British Columbia. And again, after 2 years, very little difference. We saw some increase in SPAD values, which is just chlorophyll density in the leaf, but nothing overwhelming. This was one in Chicago where we amended real-world street tree pits with biochar and fertilizer and the combination of biochar and fertilizer. And what we found was when we combined biochar and fertilizer, we did see increased growth. But that if we had biochar alone or fertilizer alone, we didn't see those increases. They were no different than our control treatment, which just received the augering. And then again, over in the UK, where we were comparing 5 different types of biochar, we had best visual differences with the hardwood mulch, but one of the more interesting things was that the best response above ground had the least fine root growth below ground, which made us scratch our head and think back to some of those preliminary studies I was showing you about root to shoot ratios and how do we apply and how does that influence where the tree allocates its resources. And then we started thinking, well, can we use the porosity of this char particle to essentially load it with something good, a fertilizer, a phosphite compound, as a way of channeling or storing that product in the short term and giving it up over time to the tree, kind of like a controlled release mechanism. And again, 2 years, not a whole lot that we saw there. So the conclusions with growth and visual ratings and sort of our client course perspective is that biochar alone isn't going to do much. And this is raw, hungry biochar that doesn't have any water or nutrients to speak of. It's more a conduit. But we would combine it with the fertilizer, we combine it with compost. There's something synergistic that happens there beyond just the sum of the individual components. And it's likely related to that absorption capacity, again, the ability to hang on to water, hang on to nutrients, promote microbial communities. And then, so one of the cool things that we know is that there is a definite influence on microbial partnerships with mycorrhizal fungi. That's been well proven Here's a paper again by Johannes Lehmann. If you'd like to read more about that, it's in soil biology and biochemistry. Consistently, we see shifts to promote microbial communities. Again, well documented in a couple of journals listed here if you want to read those. Phytopathology this past year published a review of how biochar influences plant pathogens and their management. And probably the neatest thing that we've done, and this will be my final slide or two here, is that the influence of biochar on Phytophthora, which is a known pathogen of shade trees. Biochar being a below ground disease, and in this case, Phytophthora being a stem pathogen, so a canker pathogen like you see here. So no connection with the soil. And what we found is that trees that were inoculated with Phytophthora canker above ground, you see the pathogen here, this darkened tissue, that when we measured that length of the expansion of that canker, the radial growth of that canker, is that that was reduced by having biochar in the soil. So the stem girdling by that Phytophthora canker was significantly reduced by having 5% biochar in the soil. Again, no connection between the pathogen, no physical connection between the pathogen above ground on the stem and the biochar in the soil. That this was an induced resistance mechanism with the plant. And here's the citation. This was published in Hort Science several years ago. And my coworker, Drew's work, this was his PhD work at the University of Washington. And this was the graphic here, is that we were around 80% of that stem being girdled in our positive control. So no treatment, the pathogen girdled about 80% of the stems. But when we had 5% biochar in the soil mix, that girdling was cut in half. But what we've seen time and time again is that if one lump of biochar is good, 2 lumps is not twice as good, and 4 lumps can even be worse. So a little bit's good, 5% consistently is our sweet spot that we are seeing in our Bartlett research, many of our partners are seeing, as well as other people working in woody plant systems. That 5% by volume, not by mass, but by volume, tends to be the sweet spot for performance and pathogen resilience. So before I freeze again, I will stop the screen share, and I'm at 8:01. Sorry, I went 1 minute over.
It's
So I'm
wonderful,
happy to
Kelvin.
take any questions.
Thank you so much. We have a large number of questions. So Joe,
Okay.
do you want to take the first one while I get the chat on so I can read it?
Sure. Waste material from, waste material like, I'll try that again. Waste material from corn contains a lot of unwanted chemicals like Roundup. By using these materials, are we not spreading out the Roundup through our wider communities and therefore into our water and food?
Yeah, I'm not a chemist. I can pass that one over to Chuck, but I imagine that the Roundup, other herbicides, other pesticides, that those chemical bonds are going to be broken at a much lower temperature than 500 to 600 C, and that those would not be carried over into the char particle.
That's correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the next question is related to, I'm having trouble here, Joe. Just give me a second. Oh, the next question is, how closely related is biochar to graphene? And can you answer that, Kelby?
I cannot. I
Okay.
cannot. I was
So
hoping you would.
graphene is a one-dimensional carbon, and the porosity of graphene is almost non-existent. So the principal reason biochars are really useful is for all that porosity that you saw in those micrographs. And although graphene has utility in some other aspects of water purification, you can think of it as a membrane. Those pores are really small, not the kinds of sizes that hold nutrients or liquid agents of any kind. So
That's what I was going to say too.
that's my answer. Joe, you want to take the next one?
Sure. At construction sites, are there general rules of thumb to follow to protect trees, tree roots, such as keeping a safe distance from a tree, etc.?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's actually, again, the ANSI standards that we operate under, the ANSI A300 Part 5 sets those standards. And then the International Society of Arboriculture has a best management practice that basically turns those standards into action items. And yeah, it is not rocket science. It is keep activities away from the trees, prevent soil compaction, set up tree protection zone, fencing. Don't create drainage conditions where you're going to promote waterlogged soils. If you do have to route utilities, which you have to do on construction sites, techniques to minimize or eliminate the impact to trees. And then again, if you have to make root cuts or impacts on the site due to necessities of construction, sort of the relative tolerance among the species and size classes is an appendix in that guide as well. So I would refer you over, but yeah, it's not rocket science, right? Keep activities away from the tree, which is easier said than done.
Okay, the next, Yale obviously didn't do it, right?
Yeah, obviously, yeah.
So the next question is, how do string trimmers girdle trees?
All right, so in wood anatomy and physiology, water and nutrient flow from the roots to the canopy is moving from the outside in. You have the bark on the outside, and immediately inside the bark we have the phloem tissue, then the cambium, and then the xylem. So all of our water conducting and movement is happening right on the outside of that tree. By going in with a string trimmer or any sort of mechanical damage, you're actually severing, once you move on under the bark, you're actually severing that conductive tissue. Again, phloem first and then xylem to the inside. So by doing that, you're essentially placing a tourniquet or amputating the ability for that tree to move water up to the canopy and then resources down through the phloem tissue. So it's essentially cutting off or strangling the tree with the string trimmer.
Okay. Joe?
Next question is, can clay be burned into biochar?
Chuck, correct me where I go wrong, but no, it cannot. It has to be a carbon organic matter, does it not?
Correct.
Right.
Next question, which I will do here. To raise the temperature to 600 Celsius, there's a lot of CO2 produced. If you're using a non-renewable fuel, which is part of the answer, I guess. But has there been benefit versus loss analysis of making the biochar material?
And again, I'm a tree guy, so know your limitations. So Chuck, you're obviously more equipped than I to answer that.
Well, I mean, the answer, what he's concerned about is on anthropogenic carbon being converted to CO2 by combustion to provide the heat for the pyrolysis gadget or widget or whatever you said. Yeah. So the answer is to use doohickey. The answer is to use a renewable fuel that came from a bio-renewable source, or fuel that came from synthesis of a fuel using carbon dioxide and reduction with green hydrogen. So there are ways around it, and we're getting smarter and smarter about replacing our oil and gases with renewable fuels, but that is the only way to reduce that carbon footprint of the pyrolysis system. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say that, again, focusing on waste materials that we struggle to do anything with already, that we're going to lose 100% of that carbon over time anyway. So that we have to focus on that as well from a carbon usage standpoint.
The next question is a two-part question. The first question is there something gained from non-charred wood chips versus biochar? And the second part of that question is, or maybe it's a combination of the first. In other words, are we missing anything by using biochar versus natural decomposition?
So what was the first one again, Joe? What was the first part?
Is there something gained from non-charred wood chips
Okay.
versus biochar?
Right. And we're huge proponents of using wood chips as a surface mulch. And if we're placing that on the soil surface as a mulch, we're going to get that decomposition, the return of the organic component to the soil. So I hope I didn't misconstrue that. We're gigantic fans of uncharred wood chips as a mulch. They over time will amend the soil, but the carbon that they are amending the soil with is only temporary, whereas the biochar carbon is going to be there for centuries. And what was the second part?
In other words, are we missing anything by using biochar versus natural decomposition?
Yeah, certainly natural decomposition is free, and wood chips are nearly free, if not free, for sure. And we need that combination. We need that active, readily degradable carbon in the soil to feed the microorganism communities in the soil. So I hope I wasn't too strong on biochar saying that could replace all other forms of organic amendment. We need both. We need that long-term biochar, but we also need the short-term consumable carbon to feed the microbial communities in the soil.
So this next question is really, might be a little bit challenging, but it's a very good question. Is biochar the same as granular activated carbon used for water treatment?
The short answer for me is no. I'll let you, Chuck, describe the chemical reasons why. But we've used activated charcoal or activated carbon in horticultural applications for a really long time. And that's typically when bad things happen, right? Either there was an herbicide spill or, a diesel truck turned over and spilled diesel fuel. Those types of situations where we're trying to lock away a contaminant permanently, like we're trying to do with water filters and the like, where we're trying to capture those contaminants and lock them away. And Chuck, please don't flame me too hard here. But the way I think about it is that with the activated carbon, we're almost locking things away on a permanent, like absorption, so that they aren't given back up. Whereas with the char particle, we're adsorbing, things are sticking to it, but not on a permanent basis. And whether it be a nutrient or a contaminant or a water molecule could be given back up in the soil solution.
Yeah.
Go ahead and flame.
So no, I think that's an accurate description. Activated carbons can be made from many different sources. Nut-derived activated carbons have high degree of microporosity that do exactly that. They lock up the molecules. There's very little space for them once they're in. They're cavity aperture materials. And the biochars have much more porosity. They have lower density, and they're a whole lot cheaper too.
So the structural component is really important, isn't it? The scaffolding,
Yes.
basically, that the biochar creates, whereas the carbon doesn't have that structure available to it. It's denser. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, it's correct. It depends on the activated carbon. There's many, many different activated carbons. So some of them are more biochar-like than others, but it's a really good question, and it really comes down to the act. It's like Kelby said, not one biochar fits all, not one activated carbon fits all either. So it's a complex question, and it's going to depend on a side-by-side comparison of two specific compositions to draw that conclusion. Anyway, next question, Joe.
Yeah, great. You're going to have to help me pronounce this second word. So are mycor added to biochar,
Mycorrhizae?
mycorrhizae, thank you,
Okay.
added to biochar, or are they present in soils?
Good question. See, Chuck, you were excited about that activated carbon question. I'm excited about this one. So for those of you who aren't aware, mycorrhizae is a partnership between mycorrhizal fungi that exist in the soil and plant roots. So in this case, a tree root. So you can have a mycorrhizal fungus present in the soil and a tree root, and they don't partner, and they're two separate organisms. But once they partner, they're considered mycorrhizae at that point. And it's a carbon exchange in the ground. So whether it be water or a nutrient that may be limiting to the tree. So let's take phosphorus, for instance, might be in low supply in the soil. And trees have a difficult time extracting phosphorus from soil for uptake, whereas the mycorrhizal fungi have higher affinity transporters, so they can rob phosphorus from the soil when the tree can't. So those partnerships form, and the mycorrhizal fungus will give the tree some phosphorus, and the tree will give the mycorrhizal fungus some sugar. That partnership can occur. Doesn't have to occur. And plenty of studies show that when the getting's good in the soil and there's plenty of water and nutrient to go around, the tree is going to break down those partnerships. Why would it pay a fungus to do what it can do itself? But when times get lean, then it makes more sense to pay the mycorrhizal fungi a lump of sugar in exchange for some magnesium. So that's mycorrhizae in a nutshell. And there's plenty of data out there actually in the urban shade tree literature to show that even these crummy, compacted soils that we see on developed sites, think about a parking lot, tree island, even in those soils, that there is still plenty of viable mycorrhizal fungi propagules in those soils. So there's a term we call inoculum potential. So it's the potential of those soils to partner with plant roots. And actually at Virginia Tech, Dr. Eric Wiseman's an urban forestry professor there, and he showed this when he spent time at Clemson University, that those soils in parking lot islands have the same exact inoculum potential as forest soils do. We just have to create the right environment for those partnerships to occur. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but there are commercially available inoculum sources for mycorrhizal fungi. There again, it's a buyer beware market. There are no quality control metrics by which you can measure these products by. Again, Dr. Wiseman did work, and he found that every single one of the commercially available mycorrhizal blend products that he purchased as part of his research project were dead on arrival. So no viable fungal propagules in those products whatsoever. But when he applied them to his test plants, which used corn as a bioassay plant, when he applied them to those corn bioassay plants, they grew more biomass and they were greener. Well, lo and behold, he sent the products off to the soil test lab, and what's in there? Fertilizer. So people buy the mycorrhizal products thinking, oh, wow, look at how great these mycorrhizal fungi are working, when they're actually just fertilizing their plants. So we take the approach of, if you build it, they will come. And plenty of literature to show that if you give the proper soil environment, promote water, aeration, drainage, balanced chemistry to those soils, those partnerships will form as needed, and they're constantly in flux. So we're not big fans of the commercial blends that are available. We do it usually by client request, but we never do it alone. We always do it with some other form of soil improvement to sort of build that long-term ability for those partnerships to be sustained. Sorry, long answer. See, Chuck, you got me going.
That's okay.
It's like you talking about carbon.
Yeah, well, I could, yeah, but your answer actually, yeah, was very helpful. Do you have a list of resources to make biochar in our area? Is there a place to purchase biochar in our area? And of course, you don't live in Pennsylvania, but maybe on the Eastern Coast, is there?
Yeah, probably who I would refer you to is there's a guy, Mark Hyland. His business is called, hang on to your hat, The Organic Mechanic. And Mark is based there in Pennsylvania, and he does all types of soil blends. So I would refer you to Mark. I know he has, he and I have been on the agenda together talking about biochar. He's been working with biochar quite a while, just as long as we have. So I would refer you to The Organic Mechanic.
Thank you. And then the second is great presentation. Where could we learn more about root growth of trees that you went over?
I would refer you to, again, the International Society of Arboriculture. I think the website is isa-arbor.com. And the ISA has held 4 conferences now called the Landscape Below Ground. And they there are 4 publications from those symposia that kind of give brief overviews of all the research below ground with urban shade tree. That would be a good place to start. Certainly the ISA has a lot of information available on their website otherwise, but if you want to see the literature, that would be the place to start. Landscape Below Ground.
Thank you. You want to get the next one, Joe?
Sure, it challenges my memory skills. How do you facilitate the pairing of tree roots with mycorrhizae?
Oh, wow, we can't facilitate it. Again, we in the tree care industry, well, I'd say all of us in horticulture tend to think that more is better. Maybe it's not just our industry, but like mycorrhizal partnerships are a must. And if they're not happening, something is wrong. But again, if we look at more of the forestry literature, it shows that only under limiting circumstances do some of these partnerships actually occur. So I don't want anyone to leave here thinking that if we don't have mycorrhizal partnerships, that's a bad thing. It could actually be a good thing. But as we know, conditions change. We run into drought conditions, and there's absolutely nothing we can do to control that. And so having sort of the pipe stuffed, if you will, of ensuring that we have diverse communities through the aeration, the amendment of soils, so that they're sitting there on the bench, essentially, so that when limiting circumstances do occur, they're ready to partner. So there's not a whole lot we can do to facilitate those partnerships. And in some cases, the more we do to care for the trees and create the optimum growing environment, the less they have to rely on those mycorrhizal partnerships.
Okay, so Marie is thanking you for an excellent presentation. They built a small forest when protected trees while they were building. They did not lose any trees. It works. Interesting, while doing soil probes before building, the topsoil was anywhere from 6 to 10 inches deep from decomposed natural materials. They used shredded leaves as a mulch in the landscapes and gardens. Also used leaves along with wood chips to mulch around newly planted trees. Thank you again.
Yeah, it's amazing. Nature knows what it's doing, right? And we don't mess that up. And when we try to recreate it, things work out pretty well.
And then Robert actually put in the chat the link to the organic mechanic.
Okay, excellent.
It's in the chat. It's organic mechanic soil.com.
Excellent.
So anyone else that wants to look at that can look at it.
Thank you.
I have a question around water retention in biochar and how important is wetting the biochar with liquid water to carry the nutrients to the trees, since intrinsically biochar tends to be hydrophobic.
Right. So what we have found through experience is not only is there the potential negative effect of that raw, fresh, dry biochar out competing the tree for nutrients, but it's also going to potentially compete with it for water uptake. So what we do to combat that is it also makes it a lot easier to work with the char particle if it's wet. It's a lot less dusty. And as we're cultivating the biochar particle, if it's dry, it tends to float on the soil surface. So if we're using that air tool and trying to drive those particles down into that, say, 6 or 8 inch depth, they tend to float unless they have some mass to them. And the easiest way to give them mass is to wet them down. So for all those reasons, biologically not competing with the tree and then making it less dusty and easier to work with and in the soils, we just simply wet it down. So we will take the bag of char, and while or prior to our cultivation of the soil to begin with and break up that soil compaction, we'll actually just fill that bag full of water so that it seeps into and breaks that hydrophobic nature of the char particle, wets it down, and then makes it heavy and eliminates the dust. So then once we have the soil cultivated, then we'll spread it out on the surface. It's less dusty and it has more mass so that it will move down into that 6 to 8 inch depth. It seems to be, it works. And again, we're typically, it depends, again, every situation is a little different, whether or not we're using granular pH modifiers and fertilizers or whether we're using liquids. Sometimes we use liquid like micronutrients like manganese or magnesium. That's going to be a sugar or a chelate liquid. So we'll also sometimes soak the char particles in some of those nutrient solutions as well.
Okay. Do you recommend the book, was it mycorrhizal planet? How symbiotic fungi work with roots to support plant health and build soil fertility, by Michael Phillips.
I don't know that text, so I can't say whether or not I do or don't recommend it. So I'm sorry.
Can you mention again the book you showed in the beginning? Maybe Betsy wants to just, Betsy, can we unmute Betsy and she can just ask directly?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thanks. There was a resource you mentioned in the beginning. You joked about it being something that would help us sleep at night if we...
Oh, right. Yeah, Marshner's mineral nutrition of higher plants.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. And it's really not that bad. Just have to try to have some humor to keep me awake.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you. Appreciate that.
And I think Robert just put that in the chat as well. I think you just put the Amazon link to that book.
Okay.
If I'm not mistaken. It's 8:29 and we just, I think, need to give Kelby a great round of virtual applause.
All right.
For informing us and Really enjoyed having you, Kelby, and obviously from all the questions and interest of the audience. Thanks for taking the time and joining us at Maria.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for bailing me out on the hard questions there, Chuck. I appreciate it. Sorry for the technical difficulty there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelby.